Hello YouTube and hello Yusuf. Um, uh, and hello to the rest of my subscriber base. I feel like I've been making a lot of videos and haven't been making a lot of I've been making a lot of videos directed at one person, and it might be getting boring for my subscriber base. So I've got a few ideas for videos um, that aren't so myopic. So bear with me. Right? I'm just trying to respond as things go along. Um, Yusuf, you sent me two videos, and I'm gonna, um, I watched them a couple times, um, and the second time I watched them, I just took down a couple uh, thoughts that I had, not necessarily responses, but just thoughts that popped into my head. Um, uh, okay. So, uh, first of all, just housekeeping. As far as Google Plus goes, just make a Gmail account and PM me the address of the email address, and then from there it's pretty easy to set everything up. Um, as far as Skype goes, I have a Skype account, but I'm never on it. Um, and I actually, believe it or not, even though I have a, even though I've been putting up so many videos lately, I actually don't spend that much time on my computer. Um, uh, so, um, I can give you my Skype address, and I will. I'll PM it to you, but you're not likely to see me on. It would be better if you were to PM me, like, we could talk about what time, you know what I mean? And in some way, I'd prefer to continue this dialogue in some form like that, rather than keeping to make videos back and forth, just because I'm nervous that my subscriber base is like painfully bored um, with this, because it's very nerdy talk, and I love it very much, but um, but it might feel exclusionary to some people. Um, uh, so maybe some kind of format like that. In the meantime, though, I'll just continue making video responses. Um, so that's 3 minutes of not content out of the way. First first thing I wanted to respond to was Jesus and the Essenes. Um, the Essenes. Um, First of all, I mean, I know that there are varying accounts. Um, I but I had always heard that they just got annihilated when the temple was destroyed. Um, a lot of the sects of Judaism that were around at the time ran um, from the coming onslaught, and therefore their version of Judaism survived, and the Essenes stayed and fought and just got slaughtered. Um, I don't necessarily know if that statement is historically accurate, but uh, it seems, or I'll just say it's the version of that history that I like the most. Um, um, Also, whether or not Jesus was affiliated with the Essenes is an interesting question. And you sort of raise it and dismiss the idea. I think that we tend to, and I think you'd agree with this, we tend to think of first century Palestine, where these conversations were taking place, as being sort of hermetically sealed off. Uh, we tend to think of um, it as a vacuum, and as though Jesus was just interpreting Mosaic law, or just something like that. And you see this uh, I think I've heard Sam Harris make the criticism that, like, you know, Jesus was a highly provincial figure. He didn't travel very far, which is true. He didn't. It depends. There are some. I know there are some Gnostic writings that describe him traveling in his, you know, in that gap between 12 and 30, um, which might be true. But one thing that definitely is true is that uh, where Jesus was kicking around was a bustling center for trade. Um, it was it, there were all sorts of people coming in and out from different parts of the world, um, and this realization has led people to postulate that, because, if the Gospels tell us anything about the character of Jesus, particularly a young Jesus, it's that he was a very curious person. He seemed to know a lot, and to want to know a lot. Um, and in that environment, it's just not a stretch, at least from a Christian perspective. Um, and I don't ever like taking on the Christian perspective, because I don't identify as a Christian, right? So it's perhaps presumptuous. But uh, there's from a Christian perspective, it's not too much of a stretch to say that Jesus was actually very likely influenced, or took some influence from like Eastern religions, for instance. People have noticed that certain statements that Jesus makes are statements that are very similar, to statements that from Confucianism or Buddhism or something like that. And that's, a few people have tried to explain that in terms of either Jesus traveling to the East um, during his early adulthood, before he started, you know, being the Jesus that we know, those 3 years of his life, or that him being in the kind of locality that he was, that was so centered on trade, and so multicultural for that time period, that he may have picked up influence from that. And how that relates to the Essenes is that I'm hesitant to say that something like Jesus wasn't affiliated with the Essenes, um, because it was going on there at the time, and these movements were actually, incredibly porous. There weren't really hard and fast lines. So the notion that Jesus's image of Judaism may have been in part formed by Essene teachings, which would explain why, the Essenes are seen by some as proto-Christian. That notion doesn't seem outlandish to me. I'll put it that way. Speaking as somebody who's, has only a cursory interest, I'm not a scholar in the subject, and it's just something that I have a passing interest in, and I've read a few books here and there. It would seem to me to be more unlikely that Essene Judaism didn't impact Jesus' teachings. Um, uh, so that's one thing that I want to get to. I might split this up over a couple of videos, because I have a lot more. um, Another one is the relationship of early Christianity to the Old Testament, which of course was a contentious issue. So you say in there something like, the early Christians rejected the Old Testament or something, and it's not. Uh, you say it in a way that I think might. I don't think you mean it in the way that you say it. It comes off a little bit uh, um, like all early Christians reject the Old Testament, right? And for instance, you know, even if we forget the early Christians, there was the fact that Marcionism happened, at all meant that there was a debate, um, and a very serious debate. And if you read someone like Irenaeus, right, um, talking about how Jesus is the final and full revelation of God, and therefore we need to preserve the Old Testament, but we need to read it through the lens of the New Testament, right? Because the Old Testament is sort of imperfect, and through Jesus' revelation, it sort of can retroactively be understood. That idea was obviously present, right? Not necessarily in the first in what you're calling early Christianity, but Irenaeus was between 2 and 300 A.D. So that's pretty damn early. It's not certainly not late Christianity. Christianity was still building itself at that time. You mentioned also anti-Semitism in Judaism, and I remember the distancing, the being in competition with the Jews. There's slightly more to it than that also. So like the Gospel of John is the latest, and I've seen a few places where biblical scholars suggest that possibly John, because that's where a lot of the anti-Semitic readings of Christianity come from. It's the one where the Jews ask for like the blood curse of Jesus to be on them for all eternity and all that. And I've read readings that suggest that the reason why is that John was likely it likely had to do with the fact that the Jews were being essentially exterminated by the Roman Empire, and the Christians wanted to, sort of for their own safety, distinguish themselves from the Jews. So it's not just an issue of we're in competition, but it's also an issue of survival. If we identify ourselves as Jewish, then we might well be put in danger. Our communities might be put in danger and such. And this is where some of the anti-Semitism comes from, or what was later read as anti-Semitism, which is an interesting thought. I don't necessarily want to make a really strong claim about it, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. And we tend to also to do this. We tend to divorce the books of the Bible, particularly in Protestantism, divorce the books of the Bible from the context within which they were written, which all four Gospels were written during times of revolution and political unrest and all of this, and they're all sort of articulations of a political reality. They're not something that is solely theological. They had political motivations behind them, and that's something that's probably just not appreciated enough. That they arise out of a certain context. So you can criticize the Bible for being anti-Semitic and point to John. This is what I want to say. This is something like contra someone like Beelzebub, right? You can criticize the Bible for being anti-Semitic, and you can point to various passages in John that would support that claim. but that what that does is to dehistoricize. It's an ahistorical reading of the Bible, which is like profoundly problematic. And I'm sure that there's almost no reason to shit on someone like Bilsy Bob or Bionic Dance because it's just there's no. Yeah, I just sort of when I see videos from them, I just end up looking at them and being perplexed, more than anything else. To be so incurious and so convinced of at the same time is just like it's psychologically interesting to me. I'll put it that way. Um, uh, so Irenaeus and reading the Bible through the perspective of the New Testament. This is something that also perhaps a lot of Protestants and perhaps a lot of atheists don't necessarily understand, is that from a Christian perspective, or at least from through the perspective of Irenaeus, which is somewhat canonical, somewhat like very important, at least in the shaping of how we conceive of reading the texts. You should really start with the New Testament and work your way backwards to get a better understanding of Christian theology. And I think perhaps we could say that Protestantism and the the forms of atheism that you were discussing might have it backwards in that sense when trying to speak with the voice of a Christian, right? They're trying to read the Old Testament first and then go to the New Testament. Would be like the Westboro Baptist Church or something. If you take Scripture alone and then read it from the Old to the New rather than from the New to the Old, you might get a very different conception. Right? And I don't mean to condemn the Old Testament, right? I think the Pentateuch, when it's situated in Judaism, right, in the discourse and tradition of Judaism, I think it takes on a very different character. But ripped from that, ripped from its home, which is what the Protestants kind of do. Ripped from its home, it takes on something. It takes on a much more malevolent dimension, which is interesting. I don't want to make strong claims. You link the new atheism to Protestantism again. I agree, but I would also claim a user who I've kind of crossed swords with a couple times, Socrates, I think 856, posted in my video a sort of handful of genealogies of different kinds of atheism that I more or less would agree with. Feuerbach and Marx and onward being one. Nietzsche through unfortunately probably through Ayn Rand and on. So and then like Hume and you can trace out these different lines of post-Reformation atheism, which I do agree that the Reformation is a key factor in the rise of the Enlightenment, and that's what I was thinking of when I was talking about how there's something nice about sola scriptura and all of that. But so there are these different genealogies of atheism, but again, and I've stated this a few times in other places. Again, I think that what we see in YouTube atheism and what's referred to, what I tend to refer to as the new atheism, Dawkins, Harris, Dennett, Hitchens, and onto YouTube, is you see an explosion of what I would call post-positivism, right? So the arguments and the way they conceive of the arguments and the way they think through the issues is deeply rooted in Anglo-American logical positivism. Um, so someone like Bionic Dance owes much more to Bertrand Russell and the Viennese school and stuff than she would ever realize. And I think she's more, and I don't mean to insult Bertrand Russell by saying this. She obviously has a very stupid position, and the positivists were intellectuals. I don't mean to insult them. They had intellectual teeth. She's kind of a poor facsimile of the positivists, if you know what I mean. So like Ray Comfort is to Tertullian or someone, as Bionic Dance would be to someone like Bertrand Russell. Just the intellectual meat is evacuated and just sort of the bones are left. But YouTube atheism, as we tend to conceive it, has much, doesn't belong to the tradition of atheism that Nietzsche inaugurated, or the Marxian tradition of atheism, which I would say then I'd link Freud to that. I don't know if Socrates did, and he might, he has a tendency to jump on my videos and tell me all the ways in which I'm wrong. The Freudian, but conceiving Marx conceiving of and Feuerbach and all, but I know Marx best. Marx conceiving of religion as the zero level of ideology that keeps our socioeconomic relations of exploitation in place and blah 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 blah. The story, and then Freud conceiving of it as a projection of our whatever, like of our unconscious faculties and blah blah blah. I think that you can trace out a line from Marx to Freud in the sense of atheism, which is interesting. Again, it's all I'm raising here, but I don't think that YouTube atheism can be said to arise out of atheism in the sense in which you mean it, right? YouTube atheism, like I understand it at least, is arising from a radical dumbing down and popularizing of Anglo-American philosophy in the late 19th, early 20th century. So that notion is important. This is going to be like a 45-minute long video, so I apologize. So Gandhi, you mentioned. Gandhi's interesting because his practice of nonviolence actually wasn't a Hindu practice. He got his strategies were based in Tolstoy, and specifically The Kingdom of God is Within You. Tolstoy you might think through as a heretic. He was excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901, I think, around there. But he outlined what he described as Christian anarchism on the grounds of a sort of radical pacifism that's derived from the Sermon on the Mount and blah 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 blah. And Gandhi sort of got like everything from that. Like that was the spark that did it. So actually, Gandhi is and his political strategies were more Christian Orthodox than they were Hindu. That's something to be noted. I'm sure you know that, but if you didn't, I'm sure you'd like it. The notion of you mentioned Gandhi. Also, if we take up arms, we'll be like the British, right? This is in philosophy. This is known as mimesis, right? you begin to resemble the enemy. Or the Beowulf thing, when fighting monsters, make sure that you do not, take care to make sure you don't become a monster. That's called mimesis, and there is something about mimesis as a concept that's especially pertinent to atheism as I read it. Um, Atheism, uh, insofar as atheism is a position that is in dialectic, right? Insofar as atheism is steeped in counter apologetics. I don't mean to say that's all it is, but insofar as it is, it's about the dismantling of someone else's arguments, or at least this is the way in which it's sort of come to realize itself. It's about picking apart Christian apologetic arguments, and there are a few sort of positive arguments, against the existence of God, but it's mainly the project is to criticize, teleological and cosmological, ontological argument, whatever, all of these. And insofar as that's the case, insofar as it's contra theism, right? Insofar as it's in dialectic with theism, then it is defined by the theists, it's defined by the limitation. It has the same intellectual limitations as the particular theists that are being argued with. I'd make that claim, and there's something of a mimesis in there, right? If you want to, if your atheism is organized around arguing against Ray Comfort, for instance, your understanding of religion can only be as good as Ray Comfort's arguments for religion. You see what I mean? And I don't think everybody, I don't think there's anybody who only argues with Ray Comfort, right? But if your project is to debunk William Lane Craig's argument, if he's the guy who if you zero in on him, there's a danger that your understanding of Christianity will begin to resemble William Lane Craig's, and you will be basing your atheism on the rejection of William Lane Craig rather than the rejection of a much richer tradition. In some way, you're arguing with the stupidest guy in the room is not good intellectual practice. That's the point that I'm trying to make there. But I do think that atheism as a negative claim, or as a negative discourse, as something that's about the rejection or the not acceptance or the disbelief rather than a belief, right? As something that's negative, I think that the issue of mimesis is something that needs to be thought about much more, personally, because it's very easy to pick on creationists, but like, what do you get out of it other than getting off on wrecking them? It's much more interesting for me to seek out religious minds and religious thinkers that have something substantive to say, and to ponder those questions, because I feel like that's just much healthier intellectual work. And the notion of, like, again, I mentioned this before, but the core idea is that the internet doesn't want to be smart. The internet just wants to be smarter than you. I don't think that's always true. But I think that there is that strand in the YouTube atheist community, this sort of ponage culture. So yeah, that there's all of that mimesis and atheism. Now, Faithfulness. This is a really interesting statement. That faith should be conceived as faithfulness rather than something else. Now, I think, or it makes me think of Derrida, Jacques Derrida. Um, in his writings on religion, he associates Christianity with with vocation and the experience of calling out, right? Um, that that gesture is sort of the core of Christianity. And so in the discourse on doubt, right, and doubt being constitutive of Christianity, this can be a really interesting way into that idea that if you call out for somebody, that already implies the possibility that they might not be there. You see what I mean? I wouldn't call to somebody who I knew was there or who I knew was listening, right? I call to somebody like that's there's something impotent in the very gesture itself, which means that at this way of thinking about Christianity means that the dialectic between belief and doubt is seeded into the very fabric from the beginning of the religious experience. There's something really beautiful about that, I think. And when you talk about faithfulness, this relates to the notion of fidelity to the experience of calling, rather than the ontological status of the one who is being called to. Again, this, in other words, it has more to do, or in other words, to really put it in formal terms, faith is an existential category, not an epistemic category. It's not something that's supposed to tell us about or inform our thoughts on whether or not something exists, or existence claims at all. But it's rather something like an experience that we have, and a mind that we try to cultivate in looking at the world. Right? It has to do with I, as a human being, am, to put it in Heidegger's terms, am thrown into the world. With no knowledge of what I'm supposed to do or anything like that, just cast in here, and there's the angst that emerges from that. Like, there's a it then causes us to call out, right? And it causes us to attempt to be true to. So in some sense, like, Critchley talks about how Christianity is true, or when talking about the truth of Christianity, we should be talking about truth in the sense of being true to, rather than X claim is true. So there's that dimension, which puts the whole thing in an existential light, which then I think confounds a whole the whole discourse of new atheism in a certain way. To think through Christianity in that way, to think through there is no guarantee that there is somebody on the other side of my call. There is no guarantee, but the act of calling itself is what it's based on. In some way, you could. What's interesting is to even say, rather than theism is belief in God, theism is fidelity to the act of calling out for God, or calling out beyond, if that makes sense. That's an interesting idea that I'm throwing out there. recklessly. um, one more thing too is the notion of um, the notion of the law, right? And I was thinking about this. You sort of touched on it very very briefly, and it set off in my head a critique of Protestantism, a kind of critique of Protestantism, or a thinking through of Protestantism. I've heard evangelical Protestants make the claim in debates and such, the notion of can an atheist be a good person? And they'll say, yes, the law is written on all of our hearts, and blah blah blah. And C.S. Lewis takes this logic as an apologetic grounds, but the law is written on our hearts is the idea, which then makes me pause, right? Because then, from a Protestant perspective, how did the law get inscribed upon our hearts? If you recall, God didn't put it there. If you're a fundamentalist, then you believe that the law being inscribed into our hearts is the source of our human ontological deficiency. It was caused by the serpent, right? We ate of the tree of good and evil, and therefore we gained moral knowledge. So the law being inscribed in our hearts is not a virtuous thing. That's part of our failing. I feel like if you really want to be consistent in a fundamentalist or a really Bible thumping evangelical way, if you really want to be consistent, then I'm not sure how you deal with that. I don't know. Maybe there's some Protestant watching what I just said, and they'll inform it. Probably no one's gonna watch this video. It's abused because it's damn near 40 minutes long so far. So yeah, there's that notion that I think is interesting. Then the last thing I wanted to say. Send me your videos on heresies. I'd love to watch them. Or I'll go through your channel when I'm not exhausted, and I'll watch them. And I'd be open to doing something or whatever. I don't know what I'd do. I have this terrible habit of saying I'm thinking about doing a video series on X and then just never doing it, or thinking through a video series on X and then never doing it. So don't take it, too seriously, the idea that I'm going to do this, though it's something I'd like to do, I'll put it that way. I feel like I'd have to hit the books again before I could really give any fair thoughts on any of the heresies. So yeah, and also you mentioned Islam. I never ever talk about Islam, and the only reason why is because I know fucking nothing about Islam. That's not to say I don't know anything about Islam. I have a very rough sketch of what it is, where it came from, who the players are, what the practices are. I have that kind of thing in my head. But other than a few texts that I've read that discuss the notion of causality, which I know is a big thing in Islam, or Islamic theology. Other than a few texts here and there that I've touched on, and some poetry and such, and also economics too. Adam Smith stole a lot of his lines from Islamic, really early Islamic economic theorists. So those are sort of my ways into Islam, but I really don't make statements about it. I'm just really not qualified about it. I'm hesitant about making statements about Judaism also for the same reason. I feel like I can only be somewhat light on my feet, and even then barely so when talking about Christianity. So yeah, have a good day, and this is the longest video I've ever posted, so congratulations on that.